Welcome to Finlos Loves. I'm happy to welcome back Eva as co-host, to which she brings her knowledge and experience for this series about the 5 love languages. Whether on social media or in pop culture, it seems as if these 5 methods of giving and receiving love have become a near ubiquitous shorthand for discussing personal tastes in people and determining potential compatibility in relationships. This conversation has been broken into segments. The first segment allowed Eva to present a brief history and context for the 5 love languages, as well as some new and emerging alternatives to that framework. In this segment, Eva begins working through each of the 5 love languages and their connections to patriarchy and colonialism. This episode includes discussions about quality time, physical affection, and words of affirmation, though we will come back to that last one again in the final segment. We remind you that this is a show about communication, both how we express communication and how we receive communication from others, because, as with all parts of any relationship, communication is reciprocal. We hope you enjoy listening.
I don't know. I think I'm going to start with time together. Yeah, I think it's quality time together. There's where that even comes from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and to do that, we have to kind of think back, right? And I do want to say that something that one of my early mentors taught me that really helped so that we can close up and give closure to the decolonial language that we're using is that if you go far back enough, you can find who the original stewards of land were, no matter where you're from, whether that be England, Scotland, and because we are mixed, part of my family is from northwestern Spain, and then part of my family is from Cuba. And so northwestern Spain, you're now talking about the Celts, the Celts who were colonized by the Romans, right? Again, they had indigenous ways of being and knowing and of worshiping. And so belief systems do play a big role in how we see gender roles and how we love and how we show and express love, and also our attitudes towards sex. And so this is important because you'll see as we talk about the time together that it changes depending on where we are. And so even thinking about time together from the lens of, okay, we were nomadic at one point in time. And we stopped each night and we set up camp and we slept near each other. We had children in groups, in community. Okay, we were engaging in love and in community and in family structure in a very different way, really not that long ago. And so you have that, and you go from that to agrarian lifestyle. So even with the agrarian, farms, farm style, even if you're broken into families, you still had extended systems of family. You had more kids.
Yeah.
You had greats.
Yeah.
Elders living with you. And so coming up on what we are now, separating that work life, that division that got created made it more necessary for us to have a how we do and who does what. And it really breaks down into social strata. Where are you on that social strata? Because that's the amount of time you actually have.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I often think about time as such a luxury. And so when you talk about quality time together, when do we have time for quality time?
Yeah.
On
the weekend.
On the weekend or at 1 a.m. every night.
Which is when you're also expected to do the majority of your chores.
Right.
That the other things in your life that you're supposed to do.
That darn productivity, right?
So yeah, I think that, there was a point in time in which we depended on more people for both our survival and also for meeting our needs.
Right. And I think I think that our understanding of quality time has changed, because when we think about the love languages, I think when we say quality time, immediately most people are going to think with your partner. That's what quality time is,
Yeah.
or with your kid, maybe. Um,
And you went on a date of some sort.
right.
Like it was different.
But what you're describing is, again, one of your favorite words, community.
Mm-hmm.
Community as a source of quality time,
Yes.
and therefore you have distributed labor, because you're not just depending on a single person to
Mm-hmm.
sort of receive that, to fill that need.
Mm-hmm.
Your community, if you're in a more nomadic or even a broader family structure type of system, there are more people present to have quality time with.
Yes. Yeah. And it's people who you already trust, like people
Mm-hmm.
who you know are safe.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to play this game of like, oh, are you okay? Are you not okay? Are you like, what are the things that are going to stand in our way of being
Mm-hmm.
able to get along,
Yeah.
and so you have this really impersonal way now of, with dating apps and of trying to get to know one another. And I think the pandemic only made it more difficult and challenging for some,
Mm.
and for some it's a real, it's a real risk. It's the I can't get sick
Mm-hmm.
because I have these complications that, and then for others, it's mental health stuff that got worse during the pandemic, but that they are often weaponizing to keep themselves isolated in ways that I think are more harmful,
Mm.
because it becomes like a purity test on how much do you care in
Mm-hmm.
community,
Yeah.
and people are tired of purity tests. Like sometimes you have to trust that people will do the right thing. Like for example, if I'm sick, I'm not going to come around you without telling you that I'm sick.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you. I'm going to give you the option.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be butthurt if you tell me no, I don't want to get sick.
Right.
You know. However, I'm going to tell you, so that means that if I accidentally get you sick, I didn't know that I was sick. If I and that if I'm inviting you to my house, like, I might not like always like wear a mask. Doesn't mean I don't love you. It just means that I'm at my house,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. And so I think that, I've noticed that I hear of a lot of people who are trying to get together with other folks, and folks are they're shut-ins now.
Mm.
And some of it is health and some of it is not. Some of it is just their mental health in ways that they are keeping themselves isolated.
Right.
Yeah. And that, again, that's the lack of time with people, the lack of potential physical time too, because that's kind of for me, it almost goes hand in hand. The quality time together and some kind of physical touch goes together for me. But
And tangentially, just real quick, I think that what you just highlighted is also a way that I think the love languages do get abused.
yes.
And we've already talked about this, but it becomes a way of reinforcing the idea that people don't love us
Mm-hmm.
because they are unwilling
Yes.
to
To get together with us
to do
or
these things
to, yeah.
that we're asking for.
Yeah.
So if you don't speak my quote unquote love language,
Yes.
then you just don't love me.
Yes. You're
Yeah.
not, or you're not, you're not. And it's like the thing is that it's always going to be, and this is what gets missed in these like systems. It's always going to be a give and take. It's always going to be a collaboration or a compromise, whatever you want to call it. But that person should be communicating and you should be communicating back. It should
Mhm.
be a conversation.
Yeah.
Always, because it's also going to change over time. What
Mhm.
you need is going to change over time, and what people are going to need is going to change over time. And as you hit big milestones,
Mhm.
it's going to change all over again.
Yeah.
As people lose jobs, as people get sick, as people deal with grief, everything kind of changes what we need and what we want in a
Mhm.
moment. So I do think that this move away from that more community based, and what community based is going to look different now, obviously, because of our economic systems and how they work, and how that's then created this hierarchy where people who are at the top making most money are going to be the folks who have the most time
Sure.
accessible to do a variable amount of things, including, volunteer work, working for fun. Working for fun. That's my favorite.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And so, and I think that what that does for folks too is that it means that the ways that we delegate work that is seen as labor intensive after our jobs, like who is still bearing the brunt of that, generally is going to be femmes, women, identified people.
Yep.
And so, you add to that the history of the South, which is where we live.
Sure.
And what else are we not accounting for, and what is actively being hidden and erased right now from our own historical context, right? The folks who already had to do that kind of labor with essentially smoking guns like held to their heads,
right?
And what we don't talk about, right? Slavery, displacement, genocide, and then also genetic displacement through rape. And so,
which is just another form of planting a flag.
Exactly. Yeah. Because then you can lay claim to land. And so, I want to, like, when we get into the, I'll mention some resources that I think are really helpful to think about, in terms of like love and safety. Like, what is like, when am I going to be at my best able to like love people? And and again, like for me, it's always going to go back to safety, which is basically what having an emotional connection is, right? Because that's another term, like the whole demi thing, that's another label created to describe something that makes a lot more sense in context.
Right.
People just don't want the context because the context requires admitting to harm that is created. And so, and part of that harm in the South was separating families, separating communities. I say is because now what we have is policing, over policing, but and we've I don't think we've talked about the losing a community member last year to police harm. Well, we were talking about Tortuguita Manuel Manny, who died defending the Wolani Forest in Atlanta. Right? How are we talking about love of land? And that love of land is love of people, because you want to have an environment that supports community. When you put certain things on it, when you create waste, when you create toxicity, when you cut down forests
to build military bases, essentially.
Yes. That is harm. That is not love. And we don't talk about that. And so policing, mass incarceration, even just like big financial breaks for the wealthy, like things like that, like things where like we need to be, if we care about each other, then when we are able, we take care of each other in different ways. And so, time together is hard. It's hard for people who work all the time. The quality of the time you spend together depends greatly on the amount of energy you have.
Right.
So how you spend time together may have to shift, may have to look different depending on your life situation. And then it's, for a lot of people, it wouldn't be considered quality time. Is quiet time together watching a show quality time? Like for a lot of people it is. And for others it'd be like, no, I want to like actually do something. I want to go out. I want to, be in nature, or I want to take a trip, or whatever it is. And so we're not talking, when we talk about the 5 languages, we're not looking at how having money versus not having money impacts then whether you would be able to show somebody whose love language is gifts and time together, but time together is only going out like to really expensive fancy dinners, like how that doesn't get calculated in.
Yeah, and these are just things that are assumed and baked into it.
Yeah.
That, yeah.
Right. So, and with acts of service, I think it's the same thing, right? Marriage from upper middle class up, as access to really like a live-in housekeeper,
Sure.
right? Like if the person, whose home labor is a second shift versus they are at stay-at-home parent, which is not to downplay the role of stay-at-home parent, right? Because stay-at-home parents are also uncompensated. And, when you really think about it, it's actually multiple roles that they're playing in one single role. And I love looking at that because it gives you a better idea of what the unpaid labor might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a book that came out recently and was pretty popular. It's called The Second Shift. And so might be a good one to check out. But, when you're a stay-at-home parent, you're also operate as a nanny and a teacher, right? Because you're teaching your child like those initial reading skills, you're teaching them socialization, you're teaching them emotional intelligence, all of those things. You're also a chauffeur.
Right.
You're you're a housekeeper.
You're a cook.
You're a secretary.
Yep.
A cook. Yeah.
And again,
Therapist.
and a lot of these things are again very gendered.
Yeah.
In our in our society and the way we live.
Yeah.
It's that almost all of those things would stereotypically be attached to a femme person.
Yeah. Yeah. Even the sex piece, right? Like sex worker.
Mm-hmm.
Like you also have, make sure you're keeping your man happy.
Right. There's the servant
Mm-hmm.
language there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we do need to look when we talk about the five love languages, like where, and that book specifically, right? Like I think how people apply it might look different, and that's great. And again, like as a tool, as a starting point, but let's go a little bit deeper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and we can talk about even that within feminism, right? Like feminism gave us the right to work, except for the other half of the population that was already working.
Right.
Right. And so what we needed was not really the right to work as like a hobby. What we really needed was safety and protection from the power dynamics at work and in the home.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so
because as soon as women got to work, then they got faced with all of those sort of stop acting like a man, or why are you so
well, that was when we were able to communicate in
Right.
assertive ways.
Yeah.
Right. And so and I think that one kind of goes into the whole language about like words of affirmation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why do I have to give you praise for things that I do on the daily that are normal things
Mm-hmm.
that everybody should have to do, except you're only just learning how to do it now.
Right.
Right.
Yes. Why should a person be praised for doing the things that everybody should be doing by
Right.
default?
Right. And sometimes it's just people do like encouragement, even for things that maybe feel emotionally vulnerable and hard. But again, there's a lot of vulnerability even in just admitting that.
Mm-hmm.
And saying, this is a skill I never learned. And if you're having, I can't imagine if you're having a really vulnerable conversation with a partner and saying like, I know this is going to seem really silly. Every time that you see that I went for a jog,
Mm-hmm.
can you just give me a big hug when I get back? I know I'm going to be gross and sweaty, whatever. Or can you just give me an attaboy, like just verbal attaboy?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then it can be fun. It can be playful. You can figure out how you want to do that, together. Right. And that's a conversation. However, if I've been picking the kids up for like 2 years on my own and, one day out of the week, like I can't, and like you pick them up for like 2 days in a row, and I just don't, in my haste and in my, like, I don't ever like say express gratitude for that, or uh mention it as a wow, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Like,
that definitely is deserving of a wow.
right. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I know.
But I've been doing it every
Right.
day. You've never said anything, but now
Right.
you're expecting me to be like, attaboy. You know,
Mhm.
that's yeah, that I'm gonna feel some kind of way about that.
Right.
Right.
And so it seems as if tied into these I'm laughing because they, as we've mentioned earlier, like these love languages, they very easily fall into these gendered tropes. You've got your everything that you've just described um is perfectly identifying very common uh male insecurity, right?
Yeah.
And so words of affirmation in my mind is a very is of the love languages one that I associate probably more with men, because men tend to be more insecure,
Yeah.
or at least outward, or they wait, this is hard,
Well, no,
it's hard to suss out.
I like hearing like, oh my god, the house looks really nice. Like, I do like hearing it. I do like hearing appreciation.
Right.
Right. But I think that that's actually a better, for me in my head. Like when I hear things, it's more
Mhm.
about, are you expressing gratitude?
Sure.
Right. And gratitude doesn't necessarily have to be in words.
Right, but the way that you're describing the one time that I do the one thing and then I don't get the word of affirmation, I
Yes.
then feel,
Yeah. Like you didn't even notice that I did this thing for you.
which then feeds that, like, am I not good enough?
Yeah.
Blah blah blah, but like all of those insecurities, and then it just becomes the cycle. Is like the need for the word of affirmation is actually an act of service on the part of
Yeah.
the
It's
other
actually the
partner.
partner.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm now having to, yes, I'm having to conduct this as an act of service,
Right.
even though, because I know that you need it or want it or it makes you feel good.
Yeah.
Right.
So wait,
Yeah.
hang on. So the word of affirmation is actually an act of service.
Yes.
The need for physical attention is actually an act of service. The need for the wanting of quality time is actually an act of service, because you have to make the time. In order to
Yes.
make the time, you have to work twice as hard so that
Yes.
all the work is done and the house is
Right.
clean and the kids are in bed.
Yes.
And the giving of gifts is an act of service, because you have to work to make the money to get the gifts, or to have the time to make the gifts.
Oh my God. Are we making the argument that it's all an act of service?
Well, I think what we're arguing is that,
Yeah, you can kind of you can kind of spin it
yeah,
anyway.
but also that it's just all kinds of fucked up how we frame our relationships.
Yes.
And how easy it is to fall into these really toxic gender dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, like, that's kind of been the theme, right, of our podcast to begin with.
Yes.
It's like, how do we undo this? How do we start to just kind of like just be with each other? How do we find happiness? I do want to talk about like physical love, because I think physical love is my favorite. I don't think I think we've hinted at like why people are love starved, right?
Right.
Puritanical impositions of religion.
Yeah. And everything always being a competition.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's why it's really hard to like have meaningful time or really strong relationships with coworkers, because they're your competitors.
Oh, oh yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and sex is not part of the equation, hopefully, unless there's unethical stuff happening.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look back to pre-Christian religions, sex was celebrated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sex was something that you could appeal to with certain deities, There were deities that were specifically there to improve like your sex life, to bring you love. There were fertility goddesses, right? All of these are ways that we paid homage to certain aspects of physical love that don't come as easily, don't come as organically to us now.
Yeah.
And people really struggle. They struggle to kind of find like the right fit almost.
I think that we're also raised with very mixed messaging around sex
Mm-hmm.
and around physical intimacy, because we're very much taught to chase it and to look for it
Mm-hmm.
and to know what like sexy looks like,
Mm-hmm.
but to actually partake of it and to actually express those desires then, becomes a shameful thing or an embarrassing thing, because it
Yeah.
identifies that you have a need, or it identifies that you have something that might, like an interest or a quirk or a kink that might just be slightly outside the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And so it all gets very like, unless you are within that very much box of what sex looks like, then
Missionary style.
and I'm so I'm happy to see the progress of sex portrayal
Mm-hmm.
in media, just
Yeah.
in the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening very quickly. Like, I think that expressions of love are diversifying, and I'm happy for that. And I do own that it is a struggle for me, um because I was raised in one of these very traditional families, and expressions of love, whether they be emotional or physical or whatever, don't come naturally, because it I don't know why, they just don't. And I think it's because my parents, your parents, all
Mm-hmm.
were traumatized in their own ways, and they passed those traumas on to us. And you know what's the
Mm-hmm.
we're watching this show right now, what's the line? I remember damage. Like, there's damage.
Yeah.
We've all been damaged, and the things that should be natural, the expression of the need or the desire, like, what is wrong with that?
Mm-hmm.
What is wrong with saying I like this or I want that? Not even like with the intent of doing anything about it. Just the speaking of it
Mm-hmm.
is incredibly hard, and it
Yeah.
really shouldn't be.
Yeah. It feels almost like a social suicide almost like that feels like the risk
Right?
for a lot of people. It's like
Yeah.
they're committing some kind of like social suicide by
Right,
just
and
being
then
who they are.
the only way to talk about it is to push it so far outside of the mainstream that it's almost a caricature, like the book that
Yes.
you read, like The Ethical Slut. Like,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
and it has. I haven't read it, you have, but from what you've told
Mm-hmm.
me, like, it has interesting and valid things to say, but like the title is obviously intended to be
Yes.
speaking to that very point, that it goes beyond what most people would describe themselves at, to make that
Mm-hmm.
point. And I just it's just interesting.
Like it was a good book for its time, and I think it deals with a lot of the same sort of stuff that I mentioned earlier. That like these are people who had enough privilege to be like, okay, good, I'm good on this front. I don't have to worry about money and that kind of thing. So what I really want to focus my time in is
Hmm.
how do I get a little extra something on the side,
Right.
like
Right.
and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, there are people who didn't have that extra time, didn't have that extra money, didn't have, who like that wasn't even necessarily a consideration, and they were still doing well for themselves, like
Hmm.
within their own communities. Within, I think just sex looks also different in different communities.
Sure.
And so one of the things that I really appreciate, I think, and I didn't grow up with uh despite everything, right? Like with as much of a taboo around sex. However, there was a lot of sexual harm and abuse, and so it's a kind of a catch-22, right? Like you have these stereotypes about communities of color and being over sexualized. And then when harm occurs, that kind of gets immediately pointed at. Oh, you see,
Right.
like that.
That's what happens.
That's what happens. But that sexual harm is happening in all communities.
Yes.
And the Chapman book is an example of that, right? Where we're condoning basically marital rape on one hand, right? But let's point at the communities of color as being the over sexualized, like problematic communities,
right?
And we've seen that in the rhetoric of even politicians, not that long ago, and hopefully not again, but potentially. And I think it's really important to highlight, right? To highlight that. And so I think that's part of why I wanted to go back to like the thing, like thinking about sexuality outside the scope of even just like religion. Let's like look at it outside the scope of Christianity. And there was a lot that we can learn from like older societies about sex, right? Like even like how homosexuality and group sex wasn't taboo. And that makes sense, right? If you're traveling as a nomadic tribe, across, following the bison or whatever, right? Usually nomads are following food sources.
Right.
Or they're picking and scavenging and hunting, and you're always moving so that you're not taking more than what the land can provide. Right. And so as you're doing that, like sometimes you have shelter, but sometimes you don't. So you can only imagine, right? These like more intimate relationships were happening kind of out and about.
Right.
And it wasn't as like taboo to just kind of be like, okay, these people are just doing their thing. I'm not going to bother them.
Right. I mean, there are sounds. It happens.
It's not exactly quiet.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
And it's so like it's really hard to suss that to be like, because all of the models that we have, because at least on Turtle Island, North America, South America, all of our indigenous people are scattered to the winds, unfortunately, or they have been engulfed into other populations so that they're very hard to see. These practices obviously are still common enough. They even talk about the way that they talk about it in. We just watched Reservation Dogs, the episode when they go to the conference. Like sex is out there. Everybody knows that it's going on.
Yeah.
They trade name tags and they're
snagging.
They're snagging.
Snagging.
Like it's just but that is such a more healthy like exploration of what that looks like for that indigenous group of people, because there's no joke about it. It is just what it is.
Yeah.
It's a part of life. I think that it's really cool to be able to see that. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but I find that as we try to decolonize, like we look to examples, and they're hard to find sometimes.
Yeah, they're hard to find, and I think that everything gets unfortunately appropriated, and yeah, I think that's the best way to say it, like appropriated. I think even this is definitely not a topic for this one, it's a topic for maybe another one in the future, but like even concepts of more liberated styles of loving and polyamory and things like that were practiced more openly in pre-colonial relationships are appropriated and applied to a cultural context outside of the cultural context in which they originate from.
Right, because in their culture, they wouldn't call it. There is no polyamory.
It's just community.
It's what you do. It's just life.
Yeah. And in the sort of again rebranding, repackaging, like there's a whole new set of language that comes with it. People creating, like podcasts and personas for themselves, like that to generate sort of fellowship and I'm assuming some kind of financial benefit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to kind of keep them going, and it's great, and it's important in some ways to find community.
Mm-hmm.
However, it looks very different in the same problematic white supremacist, patriarchal, cis normative patterns
Mm-hmm.
that are a part of normal society get just reproduced inside of these concepts of polyamory. And so it becomes again about a land grab, in this case, a body grab.
Body grab.
A body grab.
Yeah.
And so with aspects of, and I know like it's hard to talk about because you don't want there. It happens in every single place in every single population, right? And like these places are also not immune to it. They're not immune to abusive, coercive behaviors. They're not immune to people who are using the right language but are really just trying to take advantage of people, and sort of addiction to the new relationship energy part of relationships, which is really just like the really strong hormones, the first like year, like 6 months to year of a relationship. Your system's overflooded. And so, and then this is a lot of what I think is hard with that concept of physical intimacy, because over time physical intimacy needs to grow and expand in ways that sometimes people are uncomfortable with, that they're unwilling to talk about, that that they may have really vulnerable and hurt parts of themselves that they need to heal up around. And so I know certainly for me, the first couple years, like dealing with just sexual trauma for years, whether I knew how it was going to show up or not. And this is from me, who I was like highly sexually motivated. I was not like afraid of sex. I was not, I wanted to have sex. I wanted to be physically intimate. I feel like maybe my drive is stronger now than it was when I was younger, but it was always there.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not even, and especially within close relationships, because that's where you want to be expressing that with safety. And even then, there's stuff that changes. Stuff changes if you have kids, when you have kids. Or not. Like sometimes, you find out that you're incompatible in ways that you didn't expect, even body ways that you didn't expect. We found out like, how long did it take before finally somebody said to me like that I had a tilted uterus.
Right.
And I was like, what? That's news to me. Like, oh, okay. Well, no wonder certain positions hurt.
Yep.
When you have a tilted uterus, you want like your penetration to look a little differently.
Yeah.
Right.
Meanwhile, we're having these very uncomfortable, sexual encounters where I'm anxious about causing you pain.
Yes.
And you're trying not to make me feel bad.
Yes.
And
I'm just gonna sit through that pain.
and we're both just really struggling. And ultimately, what happens in that is that you stop. And
you just don't talk about it because it's a hard thing to talk about.
And that was a phase in our relationship, largely because of me. Like I will own this, and that like I very much wanted to avoid those conversations because they're hard, and because they require that vulnerability and that discussion of, not in that case, not inadequacy, but in a discomfort with exploring and with trying new things.
Yeah.
And admitting that we had a problem, and that admitting that there were difficulties when there was no shortage of love, and there's no shortage of affection. So why the fuck shouldn't it just work? Right?
Yeah.
Because that's what we're told, is that love is enough. It'll just work.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's I think that it's a challenge. It's a challenging thing to be a sexual person and a person who, and this is not just me. I'm speaking, I think, in general terms. To be, it's a hard. I don't know why it's hard to sort of express that. For me, anyways, it can be difficult at times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, also to say, like as we're talking about the love languages in general, I think it's also where I think that they don't get, what doesn't get explored a lot is how their negatives is just as valid and just as important.
Uh-huh.
Like, I am not a person who does this, or this does not work for me, or like that's just as important. Like,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
Okay. I
really
hear what you're saying.
I'm not a, like, I don't,
Paco be struggling.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Are you saying so that the things that you don't like,
Yeah.
that they're equally as hard to kind of name?
Or that, yes, exactly. Or that are or that they're equally important to name.
Yes.
And that they are that it's important to be able to have ways to name the things that cause disconnect as just as much as the things that cause
Yes.
connection.
Yes. But sometimes when you communicate that, it feels like a shutdown
Right.
for the other individual. And so now, whether they want it or not, sometimes it builds like a weird resentment,
Mm-hmm.
and it sits there. And the longer it sits there, it's almost like it festers and grows. And, and sometimes it's just a simple difference that I think continuing to talk about, there might be a really simple solution to. And it's just like avoiding the talk altogether makes it worse.
Yeah.
And it's just challenging because the the fear of having the conversation is sometimes based on previous experiences of trying to have the conversation, and also like, am I going to have to do all the labor of leading how this conversation rolls out, how it continues, how we keep to coming back to it? Are you going to be annoyed with me every time? I remember you just, like, I feel like at one point, even just saying, can we have a conversation, became a trigger for you,
Mm-hmm.
because saying, I'd like to sit down and chat, or like, it doesn't matter how I named it, or like changed changed the wording around. It didn't matter anymore. It was like, just like, can we talk? Can we communicate? Can we figure this out? Became, you didn't want to do it at all. And it was like, well, we're not going to go anywhere then. We're not going nowhere. Like,
Right.
without continuing to rebroach the subject, and to turn it around, and to examine it together, and to see like what is possible, and I think that was what was really important to me, in that moment, like around, like, what are maybe perceived, because I didn't even know if our differences were perceived, and we just weren't, or if we were just not understanding each other.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that I thought I understood was that you didn't like the way that I was communicating, and you wanted me to communicate in a different way. And that when I learned to communicate in that different way, and I was very assertive about naming the needs, then you shut down in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, okay, well, I did what you asked me to. So,
To be clear, this is or to be specific, I think I said that, how am I supposed to know unless you tell me what you want?
yes.
And then you tell me what you want.
I'm like, here's what I want.
And then I'm like, well, how do you expect me to be able to do that? Right. There's always a
There's
moving.
the ceiling,
Yes. The moving of the
right?
goalpost.
The
Yeah.
moving of the goalpost, the
Yeah.
ceiling, whatever, like it keeps moving.
Yeah.
And that's not fair. That's just not fair,
No.
right? When you get to that point, you're like, okay, this is not the actual problem.
Right.
The actual problem is that you're not wanting to look at the fact that this is making you feel really uncomfortable and inadequate,
Mm-hmm.
and that comes from a place of insecurity, and that insecurity is something that I can't fix. It's something you have to fix.
Right.
Right? It's something that you have to work on, because like I can certainly meet you halfway at how do I reassure you? What are ways that I can show you love and reassurance? And once I'm doing that, and I'm also, right, communicated in a way that you've asked me to communicate, which is you're not a mind reader, you're not a guesser, so you need me to be very specific about the needs that I have. So okay, great, I'm gonna do that. Now I'm meeting you there, and nothing's happening. So what does that mean? Does that mean you don't care? Does that mean that, and that's the, I don't want to call it a problem, but that's when you ask somebody to meet you
Mm-hmm.
halfway, it requires that you also meet them halfway.
Right. An actual compromise.
And so when they meet you there and do the thing that you ask them to do, and all of a sudden you just don't show up for the conversation, or you're putting your relationship at risk every single time.
Yeah.
Because that is what love looks like, right? Love looks like a continuing growing together, like a continued conversation, like we shift and flow together. So how do we continue to shift and flow together?
Yeah. And so it seems, or I think that, I think for me, and I want you to speak to your thoughts about the love languages as well, whether we're talking about the love languages or the love styles or the new love languages, all 18 of them, whatever we're talking about. These are shortcuts and tools, emphasizing here, to start conversation.
Yeah.
And I think where a lot of people, the mistake that a lot of people make, especially as we turn to rapid fire means of knowledge acquisition, like we learn a lot of stuff. I've learned a lot of stuff on social media.
Yes.
That's great. But oftentimes what they are is they're like points of interest on a map.
Yeah.
But to get there, you actually have to
go further.
You have to go further.
Yes.
Right. So cool. You want to use the love languages. That's great. But it's not the end all be all. Telling your partner that, hey, I really I have a tendency towards insecurity because I need words of affirmation, right? Okay,
yeah.
cool. That's a great place to begin. But then actually have the conversation. What is it that I'm affirming? What is it that you're looking for? Oh, it's because I feel insecure because I come from a family with insecure attachment. So I these are the and
tie it all back.
And so what I really like, even from the very beginning of a relationship, is to show that, I care, and I like to show up in these ways. Like, the point being is that continue to have the conversation, right?
Right.
Because that's what's necessary for functioning relationships, no matter what kind of relationship it is.
Right. Or even the physical. So from the physical love perspective, right? I love sex. I like to engage in a variety of activities, and also I don't always know when something, it's been a long time. However, I am a survivor of sexual violence, and because of that, I don't always know when a trigger is going to show up for me. So making a partner like aware of that part of you, that if they have a reaction, how are we going to deal with that? And can, and also like the fear of like you taking it personally, right? Like I don't want, like, the fact that I was triggered by something to then feel to you like it was your fault, like that happened, right? It's not your fault. It's something that like predates you, that got triggered in that moment for whatever reason. Maybe it's never been triggered before and you just happen to say something a little differently, or I smelled something, or right. So these are like the depth of conversations. That has nothing to do with the fact that physical love is not my primary love language. It has something to do with something that happened to me outside of the scope of my relationship. It could be even just, I face a lot of oppression in the workplace, right? And I come home tired. And when I'm feeling like that, I'm still not feeling super safe. And so I'm trying to regain a sense of safety when I get home. And so I don't necessarily always want to be touched. I don't want to, whatever it is. That's not a one that applies to me, but it's one that I have had people explain. Right? Like, I want to be by myself when I first, and some people, like, they get their energy from being with others, and some people get their energy by doing things on their own for a while, right? That the whole, like, being more introverted, being more extroverted can play into it too. So again, those are other systems of understanding human behavior that can kind of come into play with these concepts as we think of them, of like, how do we express, and also then there's this whole like, okay, well, if you like to receive love in this way, are you always showing love in that way? And no. Sometimes the ways that, it's so funny, sometimes the ways that people like to receive love is not the ways that they show love.
Yep.
Which can be super confusing. Like, that's confusing to me.
Sure. Like as an example for me specifically, like, I really, really, really love performing acts of service for people. Yes. I'm very uncomfortable
with acts of service.
Towards me. Like, that makes me super, not all the time, but a lot of times, like, I'm uncomfortable with people going out of their way.
Right. And I do that all the time. I go out of my way.
Yeah. So with you, it's different because we understand this about each other
now, but at the beginning,
absolutely.
It was like, I was like, oh my God, today I got up on like all this, I'm a short person. So I climbed things to get places. I climbed all these things to get the dust off of such and such thing. Yeah. And I'm like, looking at you kind of like, what are you going to say? And you're like, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm like, why did you do that?
Like, you could have really hurt yourself.
Or you could have just asked me to help you, or any number of things, but it makes me really uncomfortable.
Oh, but now your allergies are going off.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, why didn't you just tell me so that I could do it for you, so that way you didn't have to put yourself at risk and you didn't have to set off all of your allergies? Like, yeah, I don't do.
Just let me show you love, okay?
Yes, exactly. That I'm way better at showing acts of service than receiving them. I think that's a really good example. I think that these are very important conversations. Like, quality time is super. I think quality time is the foundation and benchmark, not benchmark, but the foundation of probably all relationships. But not all quality time is enjoyed the same way.
Yeah.
The experiences that we have are very nuanced, and I think that they require conversation, and they require an understanding of that we each. I think what I'm trying to say is that we understand these things differently. We are all individuals, and so when we go to somebody to say, I'm a person who, like, my primary love language is physical touch. Like, what does that actually mean, though? Because I think that's a very important conversation.
Yeah. And that we're not, at least here, right? Like, my cultural context of physical touch is more expansive than some of the ways that America is used to and willing to engage with physical touch outside of the realm of romantic relationships.
Right. Like, do we hug? Do we kiss on the cheeks? Do we kiss on the lips? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Right. And so I think Caribbean folks, and also actually, like, by extension, like, European folks, like, when we say hello and goodbyes, like in different ways. And, for me, like hugging, kissing on the cheeks, kissing on 2 cheeks, kissing sometimes 3 times, a hug that goes from hug to rocking with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It all very, very familiar ways of being in space to welcome back, to say, I have missed you, I have missed your touch, I have missed, feeling all that you are. That doesn't happen in the same way, and like you have to start to kind of build a culture of touch in your own communities. And sometimes it happens easily and sometimes it doesn't.
And sometimes it gets signals crossed, because if you're a
Yes.
physically
Yes.
touchy person and you're
Fuck was talking about me again.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm talking about anybody who's physically touchy and who shows affection with touch and hugs and holds hands and sways back and forth, and then they encounter somebody who doesn't necessarily do those things in a casual way, and they misinterpret that as like a come on, or as a
Yes.
show of interest. And maybe it is, but maybe it's not. It's those cultural lines are they are interesting and complicated.
Yeah. Or even so I don't know. My behavior in social settings often gets labeled and interpreted as flirting.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it is, but it's innocent flirting and excitement. I guess like excitement, like almost childlike wonder excitement that people aren't used to.
You love people.
I love people.
Yeah.
I do, and I love connecting.
Yeah.
And so when I'm feeling it, I'm really feeling it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily like hitting on somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it does get read that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's okay.
And sometimes I am hitting on people.
Sometimes you are. And that's okay too. Again, we're straying into communication styles, but I think that all of this is part of it, because I think at the heart of love, and if we're saying love language in its literal meaning, not in the sense of this packaged product, if we're talking about the language of describing love, we're talking about how we communicate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and and to be clear, the communication for me doesn't have to necessarily be verbal. It can also be, non-verbal, but it has to be clear.
Mm-hmm.
Like there could be body language that I will take in lieu of actual language.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be there.
Yeah.
It has to be clear that it's communication. So I feel like I am fairly versatile in that way. And but maybe the level of expression that I crave or that I want, like, is just a little different.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one that can be learned, but then requires more effort, if you haven't learned it, if you're new to it, and I think that's what I was trying to say, is that sometimes love language requires us to grow new language to stay in community and communication with one another. And sometimes that's scary. That's scary because learning new languages is scary
and hard.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And anybody who's tried to learn a new language knows that. But what we do know, right? Like we do that with our professions. There goes capitalism, right? Like capitalism is a motivator, right? Almost every single profession out there has its own lingo, has its own language.
Yep.
Right? We code switch effortlessly between the language and jargon of our professions, but we don't always want to do the same amount of work when it comes to our relationships, because we are in relationship to our relationships as something that belongs to us versus something that we're working on, that we're striving toward. Right? And I think that's actually part of the problem with capitalism, is that it's made us forget that we take the people who are in our lives for granted, and the people who are in our lives do provide labors for us that are unpaid for, right? So we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be doing that. And then like to jump back to like sex, right? Like the ways that even where we live impacts sex and the sexual acts that are even legal, right? We say this at a time when we've mentioned like Florida is in a state of pulling back on equity and on recognition of harm, historical harms that would impact relationships between people and that impact historical oppression and how somebody might show up in relationship. And so that's important, but I think so is like, okay, is the way that I want to engage in sex and with particular sex acts branded as illegal in my state, right? And who's going to be willing to engage in it if it's illegal, and how, and then if harm comes to me from engaging in this act, like do I feel then that I can or can't report it even, right? Like if something happens to me. And so, and these are not things that are abnormal. We've found, this is one of my favorite examples, but we found the Peruvian moche pottery depicting so many sexual acts, some of which are illegal.
Yeah.
You know, in like some of our pre-Christian populations, right? So things like anal sex, right? That we are generally tend to associate with homosexuality, which is branded as sodomy by the Bible and considered outlawed, or it was for a long time in many, 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 many states, less states now, but I believe it's still in the books in several places. Along with that, women were property for a long time. They were considered property law, like by English law. So, it's not just people who were enslaved in our country, but by virtue of adopting English law, children and femme folks were considered property too. I mean, you treat something that you believe you own very differently than you treat something that you think of as an entity with autonomy. And so, when we think about the history of that, whether it be enslaved or indigenous populations, what we have is sexual violence happening in conjunction with colonialism and with enslavement. And out of those pairings, inevitably births through rape. And so genetic erasure of those populations in that way. And so then of course we have a sort of scary history with sex in this country, and I think that this is a good place to really talk about. There's a writer named Sarah Deer who's an attorney, and her book is called The Beginning and End of Rape, and kind of likens the rape of the land as being the original rape of colonialism as it was happening in conjunction with the rape of indigenous communities. You have that. You also have Daniel McGuire's The Dark End of the Street. And I did do a 2020 webinar, if you remember that one, the El Legado de la Conquista. So the legacy of the conquest, la violencia sexual, el marianismo y el machismo. So sexual violence, marianismo, and machismo. And it talked at length about that, about how we can't really divorce sexual violence and colonial structures from the way that we show up in our sexual relationships. Because a lot of it is fear-based, right? Like, what happens if I'm not in a monogamous marriage? I remember having, and it felt like I was in the twilight zone when I would hear clients tell me, my mom married me off when I was 13 years old, because otherwise there were gangs in, my country that would come through and rape the women. And I'm like, what? These are immigrant communities coming to the US trying to escape that kind of violence. And that was their first experience of love and sex, was being married off to much older men.
Right.
Yeah. Early, really early, having children. And this was to avoid further sexual harm. Like, that was the choice that mothers were given. Marry your daughters off really early. And how that looks differently here. Right. But we're still talking about, what is my responsibility as a single mother to get married? What is my responsibility as an individual who has a biological clock that's ticking? Like, what happens if I have children outside of a marriage versus, hey, like, I want to have children as a single parent. Like, do I just, like, I don't have the money to do in vitro. I don't have the money to do, a fertility treatment. Do I just what does it look like to have those choices? Like, do I talk to somebody about, like, hey, are they willing to just, like, impregnate me, or do I trick people into it, or what?
And then if it happens, like, wow, what do you tell people?
Yeah, what do you tell people about who the parent is?
Right. You say, oh. Yeah, that's really complicated.
Yeah, just even questions around that of that impact how we are viewed sexually based on our preferences around this particular love language. And yes, I think it bears mentioning again that women with sexual agency were not the topic of the 5 languages.
No.
And so navigating our own sexuality, navigating the orgasm gap, that not even addressed as an issue, right? So if our sexual intimacy is being disrupted because I'm just not getting much out of it, and I want to have that conversation, but that conversation is so damaging to your fragile male ego, then our sex life is not going to get any better. Right? I'm either in a place where I'm going to have to fawn and make pretend, right, that I've orgasmed so that you can leave me alone, or you don't even care about whether I orgasm or not, as long as you get yours. And that's the norm in our relationship. In which case, like the woman in Chapman's original book, of course, sex would make me feel used, and it wouldn't be something that was super enticing, and it would feel like a chore.
That's it for this second part of our conversation about love languages. Thanks for listening. In the next and final segment, Eva will continue to examine each of the 5 love languages through a decolonial lens, exploring their value as a functional interpersonal shorthand, but also their potential to reinforce harmful and even dangerous patterns. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, feel free to share them with me via social media. Email them to finlos@finloslives.com, or you can leave a voice message via the SpeakPipe app at finloslives.com. If you enjoyed this content, we hope you'll share the podcast. We look forward to our next conversation.